Will Facebook and Google play ball with the media code or start blocking Aussie news outlets?
And should Telstra's rivals be gifted free or cheap spectrum in the name of competition?
Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Aussie Broadband, changing the game with their award-winning network and Australian-based support. Hi there, welcome to Vertical Hold Behind the Tech News, where we catch up with Australia's leading technology journalists to dive into the big tech stories of the week. I'm Adam Turner, and I'm joined as always by Alex King Kong Kidman, a man who's still waiting to hear on word of his presidential pardon for attempting to overthrow the WWE and establish the Kidman New World Order. Alex, do you think you'll get that pardon and you'll finally be allowed to fight in WrestleMania this year?
Look, Adam, technically I'm not entered in the Royal Rumble, but as they say, anything can happen. And I'm going to take the words of the one and only Jesse the Body Ventura to full effect here, which when he said, win if you can, lose if you must, but always cheat.
I love it. Speaking of which, we're also joined in the virtual Vertical Hold studios this week by the other half of the Kidman New World Order, finder.com.au editor-in-chief, Angus Uncle Elmer Kidman. Gus, are you ready to don the tights and hop back in the ring?
Yes, but only if I can wear my underpants on the outside.
Well, naturally. So, speaking of a certain lack of dignity, this week tech titans Telstra and Facebook have spat the dummy and they're ready for a smackdown as they grapple with efforts by regulators to keep their power in check. First up, Telstra is unhappy that the government and regulators are potentially looking at giving rivals Optus and TPG a leg up in the upcoming spectrum auctions. Gus, what's the story here?
So it's a slightly complex story. I'll try and keep it simple. Effectively, we've got a spectrum auction coming up this year. A bunch of spectrum's getting auctioned off. This is going to be important for everyone trying to roll out 5G. Normally, spectrum auctions are about whoever bids the most money gets the spectrum. But this time around, there's been a suggestion. Basically, the communications minister has asked the ACCC to look into whether they should not make it completely fair, and instead they should guarantee that both Optus and TPG will get a certain amount of spectrum and not guarantee that Telstra will get any, and also guarantee that they may not have to pay full price for it, even though spectrums are always basically an auction where people bid for this stuff. So as you can imagine, this proposal, and it is just a proposal, they haven't definitely said they'll do it. They'll decide in February if that's actually the approach. But this is the way that they're minded to do stuff, the government has said. And normally what this government is minded to do, that's what it does. As you can imagine, this has led to a predictable reaction where Telstra has said, this is appalling and terrible and you can't do it. Optus and TPG have said, this is brilliant, you can't possibly do anything else.
So, Alex, is this just the usual argy-bargy? Has Telstra got a point of they're being potentially hard done by here?
Look, I think to an extent they are, and I think to an extent the argument has merit. It's definitely one of those kind of complex telco stories because Telstra's got a point. As Gus was saying, in the auction process, and especially for a government that likes making money out of spectrum auctions, it makes sense to say, hey, whoever writes the most zeros on the end of the check gets the spectrum. So you got that side of it. And if it's a public asset and you really must sell it off, you're sort of renting it, but that I digress, then you may as well make the most that you can, especially in these kind of slightly more challenging economic times. So there's that. At the same time, there are areas where Telstra has an awful lot of spectrum and its competitors do not. Now, Telstra can say, hey, that's just good business and we were there first. Yahoo sucks. And again, that's capitalism for you. But you could take the argument, well, having an actual thriving competitive mobile market is better for Australians generally. And I think that has some merit, especially when you consider how few of the virtual operators, the MVNOs, are actually on Telstra and how that affects the outlook for competition, especially in regional areas. I mean, I've just been spending a lot of time in regional Australia travelling around just New South Wales because of the way the world is these days. And it is striking how quickly a lot of those networks drop out and how predominant Telstra is in those markets. So this could be one way for them to catch up, to even out the playing field, if you will.
On top of which, one of the specific arguments that's been made for this is the fact that both Optus and TPG intend to actually use this spectrum to maintain their older 3G services. And we do know that, like, in competition terms, that stuff's important, not just because some people don't want to pay for 5G. Some people are scared to pay for 5G, but that's a different kind of discussion. But the fact is, a lot of the cheapest plans that are available on mobile, the ones that have a lot of data on them, are very specifically 3G only. If Optus and to some extent TPG can't offer that kind of spectrum, you're not going to see as much choice at that bargain end of the market. And this is a space that Telstra hasn't played in quite as much. It has, limited participation in this through things like Belong, but it's about, no, we're a premium product. So there is an argument that says for market equality, it's important that they have access to that spectrum, because some of the spectrum they were using for 3G, they wanted to use to roll into 5G. And they're all trying to do this balancing act of doing that. And it's trying to get a lot of things to line up together. And that's genuinely challenging. And it's going to be, no matter what they do, someone is going to complain about it.
Well, that might explain one of the things that I was a bit confused about. Because if Optus and TPG, and just for people who've been playing along at home, TPG, that's TPG plus Vodafone, right? That's what we would have called Vodafone a couple of years ago, yes?
Yeah. Well, basically, you've got three networks in Australia. You've got Telstra, you've got Optus, you've got Vodafone. If you're on a mobile phone in Australia, you are on one of those three networks, no matter what it says on your SIM card.
Yeah. But then Vodafone got into bed with TPG, but now we're calling them TPG, not...
The company that holds the whole thing is TPG or TPG Holdings or some such businessy name. They own the TPG brand. They merged effectively with Vodafone, but it was more of a takeover in real terms. So they own and run the Vodafone network, and pretty much all of TPG's brands, of course, are now on Vodafone as well.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. So that out of the way. My question is, if Optus and TPG are already running 3G networks, why do they need to bid for more spectrum to continue running these 3G networks if they've already obviously got spectrum to run them on? What am I missing?
Because some of that is stuff they would like to utilize as they move
For
on
5G.
into the new 5G space, because there is definitely overlap in those kind of spaces. And to date, they've managed to use other bits of stuff. Some of that spectrum has expired. I mean, I do not keep track of this. There are journalists who spend their life immersed in spectrum options, and I'm really, really sorry for those people. But yeah, but that in simple terms is, yes, they would like to be able to use some of that there, and they would like to utilize this stuff. And because it's useful, it's efficient, it's got the potential for long distance, which is great for 5G, but also good if you want your 3G over a wider area.
And it's also got to do, of course, with the fact that there are areas where Telstra, and actually, to be fair, there are other areas where Optus especially has some really strong spectrum holdings. And in those areas, it can, of course, balance out its usage of that spectrum across a lot more devices. It could have more customers, or just deliver that better experience that we all want. Not having that comparative to what Telstra has puts them at a competitive disadvantage. Telstra can argue, and again, I think there's some merit in this, that it's spent the money, it's done the rollout, it's paid for the spectrum in the past, it should be allowed to pay for more in the future. In a competitive sense, though, what TPG and Optus are saying is we'd like to be able to compete and offer those kinds of value to Australian customers in this way. But at the same time, like any business, they're also kind of trying to poke in hey, it'd be really nice if we didn't have to pay quite so much for them.
It's interesting. Yeah. You would think, when you think of these brands in Australia, you go, Telstra's the big one, then Optus, then Vodafone/TPG. When it comes to spectrum holdings, it's actually Optus is the runt of the litter on what's been sold so far. Telstra has the largest chunk, but TPG is not that far behind, partly because before the merger happened, TPG as a company had been buying up spectrum to launch its own network. And while it hasn't done that, it now means it's got everything that Vodafone had, plus everything it bought to build that. So it is actually number two in this discussion. And I just find that interesting because in those terms, we think of it as rare. Actually, I'm being silly to say it's rare because actually that's also true in fixed line broadband, actually. TPG is the number two player in that, not Optus.
Actually, Gus, with bringing up the ACCC raises an interesting thought that I had, which is that the ACCC, of course, took TPG and Vodafone to court because they did not want that merger to go ahead, and they desperately wanted TPG to build that fourth mobile network. Now, obviously, that is water under the bridge and hasn't happened. But do you think the ACCC is going to be more inclined to say, actually, yeah, we want this strong competition, so we will gift TPG this, based on that history of wanting stronger networks?
Absolutely, I think that, because they make this explicit point in their call for comment that this went out late last year, and now we've seen the responses from all the telcos. They very much called out, in the absence of this, we must maintain strong competition. So I think from the ACCC's point of view, they'd like that. The big unknown here, though, and the reason why I'm sure, this story is going to get revisited over the course of 2021, is that the ACCC is going to make a recommendation to the government on what to do. That's not binding. That's not what the government has to do. And even though the government has basically held up a big sign saying, hey, we really think this would be a good thing to recommend, what would you recommend? One assumes that the ACCC might line up with that and go, well, we recommend this, but there's no obligation. So if in the meantime, if there's furious virtual lobbying going on at the moment with all the telcos going in there, there's every possibility that the decision will come out and not do all of these things. So maybe they'll say, yes, we will reserve a certain amount of stuff for Optus and TPG, but if we do that, we will let Telstra also buy at a lower price. They might go halfway in and say, we'll guarantee some access, but we won't guarantee that they're paying heaps less because that seems maybe a trifle unfair. I've just said that like I believe that fairness would be the basis of this, and I don't. We will have to see.
So, guys, we're in the interesting position where the communications minister has a background in communications, which is a plus, but at the same time, there's maybe just a little teensy-weensy, perhaps alleged, don't want to get the lawyers involved, conflict of interest here, given who his prior employers were, yeah?
He previously worked for Optus, so it's always going to look interesting when someone who's previously worked for a company says, oh, I think a decision that directly benefits this company would be good. Having said that, they've been very clear that there's Optus and TPG. I think if it was just Optus on this list, the ethical thing to do would be getting someone else to make the decision. Since there's two of them in there, maybe it's okay, but it's a question that is going to be asked no matter how the decision goes. That question is bound to come up.
So just to further complicate things, back in 2019, Telstra announced its shutdown date for the 3G network, which is 2024. Assuming, COVID's thrown all other plans out of whack, but, assuming we're still going to that timetable, do we have any word from Optus and TPG on when they might shut down 3G? What will the shutdown of 3G mean for how they use spectrum, for 5G? How does it sort of affect the big picture?
I'm not aware of that having come out from the other two players. They haven't been as firm in making that statement, particularly in the case of TPG/Vodafone, because they've had to spend so long arguing about whether they're going to merge. Having any kind of forward plan has been challenging. You would think Optus would be the last one out because they do have a relatively thriving business running MVNOs, a lot of whom do buy 3G from them. So I think they possibly for that reason want to hang on to it. It will go. I mean, this is what happens. The platforms evolve. The interesting question is, will we hit the point where you can't buy a phone that does it before they switch the networks off?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting point. And Telstra, yes, Telstra did say that was their plan. And I don't think they've said a great deal more recently to indicate that they're still pushing forward with that date. As you say, Adam, they may have pushed it back because of COVID. But that being said, what we're seeing in the chipsets from the phone makers is much more a push towards 4G, 5G phones than anything else. Now, typically, all of these phones are still capable. They still tend to push backwards because historically we've always needed phones that can travel. So a lot of the phones that you buy in Australia are still technically 2G capable, for example. It's just there's no 2G to be had here. And so I don't expect that to massively change because the global market around that kind of stuff, it's too busy. There's too many variables to take into account. And it's a lot easier for a chipset maker to just say, look, scan it back as far as you can. I've not seen anything that suggests that there's a huge disadvantage to having that step down in the chipset. So I think what we won't see, and actually I can't really think of too many that I have seen recently, phones which were 3G only, because that's really a critical point of inflection. If you've got a phone that goes no further than 3G, then when 3G goes, you're in trouble. And there will inevitably, even by 2024, there'll be people who are still holding on to probably barely capable by that point, but to capable enough 3G handsets, and they will need to switch up to 4G. But at the same time, I've reviewed a bunch of phones recently which were sub $100, which were all 4G capable, and that would see you through. Well, we haven't seen an end of life for 4G, but you might reasonably expect that towards the end of the decade into the next, I would say.
But this is what we saw when they killed off 2G, the same thing. I can't remember how long ago that was now, but there was still a handful of, Nokia 2300s or whatever, 3200s or whatever, and there were people, but you could get a 3G phone for $50. So the end of the 2G network did not mean you had to go and drop a shed load of money on a new phone if you just wanted to use it the way you used your old phone.
Absolutely. If they were saying, oh, we're dumping 3G tomorrow, everyone's got to bump to 5G, you'd have a much bigger problem on your hands because the cheapest 5G phone in Australia today will set you back about $500 outright. And of course, they just scale way up from there. There'd be riots on the streets. But there's going to be a number of years for that. I think the other big difference, though, with the 3G switch off, when they did the 2G switch off, a lot of the people, a lot of the reporting, a lot of the data around that suggested that these were people with older Nokia-style feature phones. And while those feature phones still exist, you can still buy them. I'm reviewing one at the moment. They're 3G, 4G in their own right. And I think there'll be far fewer of those straight-up 3G only phones kicking around. And the people with them are far more likely to be comfortable with a smartphone because that was the other big jump that a lot of those 2G phone owners had to make.
So, meanwhile, the 5G rollouts continue across Australia, and Telstra's recently announced a bit of a 5G milestone, Alex.
Yeah, so Telstra's claiming that they've got more than 50% of the population covered by 5G. Now, as with all these things, you've got to understand what that number means. It does not mean that you could slice Australia in half down the middle and say, sorry, Western Australia and bits of South Australia, you don't get 5G at all, but it's covering the entire land. There, no, it's 50% of the population. And as a population, we live along the seaboard and we predominantly live in the big major cities. But if you do, then the odds are pretty good there's some 5G either in your area or very, very close to you. Telstra's claim is that they want to hit 75% population coverage by mid-year, and they appear to be on track to do that. And this is where the spectrum actually becomes really important because the 5G rollout is really accelerating, and we're pushing towards, and we've mentioned this before, we're pushing towards the launch of millimetre wave services here in Australia. And the important thing with millimetre wave is that this is where we see that huge speed promise of 5G. Because what we've had so far is sub-6, and look, it can get quite fast, as we've noted before. It can get faster than most commercially available NBN services, but like or any other mobile service, it's inherently both reliant on backhaul, which is fibre itself, and incredibly variable. As we see millimetre wave roll out, we start to see more of that really, really, really high speed 5G come in. But it also opens up the questions about what you charge for it, how people are going to use it, and where the need points become apparent. So, Adam, while we're on the topic of tech titans feeling like they're getting a bit of a raw deal, Facebook has rather loudly and publicly spat the dummy this week, haven't they?
This week Facebook made its first major comments since September when it threatened to pull all news links from Facebook rather than comply with these sort of in place laws that are going to force digital platforms to pay media companies for content. Facebook's Australian managing director said the new code is unworkable and complained that no other Australian law puts such a burden on particular businesses. Now, Gus, same question with Telstra. Does Facebook have a point? Are they hard done by here?
Oh, it's so hard to sort of go, oh, poor Facebook, I feel so sorry for them. Like, it's really, it's such an unnatural space to go into. But on that particular point, on the notion that this is an unusual law and it's strange and it would require a lot of negotiation, they're right. I mean, I think it's been clear. Yeah, this law has been discussed a bunch of times on the podcast. We know there's lots of issues with it. It's not really clear how it would work or how the negotiations would work. I think there's a point to be said that like it doesn't feel like this is really planned out in a way that's supposed to be spectacularly sensible. That said, a lot of the critiques of this law have been about how ridiculous it is relative to Google. There's been less talk about how Facebook deals with news and how that presents that in its algorithm and so forth. I think what's notable is how they're planning to do the dummy spit. As you said, the previous dummy spit in September, they kind of said, oh, we'll just stop showing news. Now what they're saying is, oh, we won't roll out Facebook News, this kind of platform where they say they're going to bring in additional funding and make it easier for stuff to be visible. So it's like, well, if you don't let us do what you want to do, we won't bring in this new thing. I treat that with a kind of biblically sized grain of salt because lots of these Facebook experiments never get to Australia. Australia is a blip for Facebook. It's also a blip for Google, but I think it's a bigger blip based on what we know about their tax records. So like they're kind of going, oh, if you don't do this, we won't roll out this other thing. I don't totally believe it because Facebook is massively dependent on sharing news. There was a study, I think about 18 months ago, that said the most shared content on Facebook was actually perfectly regular news stories from Associated Press. So it wasn't even the kind of manic stuff that we often associate with Facebook fringe groups. It was just like very straightforward, generic reporting on topics of interest. If people can't share that stuff, if they just stop surfacing that, I think about my own feed and I think, wow, that would radically change because that's at least half of it is people just saying, here's something I've seen, and then talking about how they feel about it. But it's right in there. So I think maybe the threat rings a bit hollow for me. I'm not sure they'd actually go ahead and do it because I'm not sure how much of a business they would have if they did.
So at the same time, though, and I find this incredibly amusing, really, that Facebook's complaining it's really, really hard to do business in Australia. At the same time, though, they're claiming they don't do business in Australia. How does this work?
Well, it's what happens when you can afford really expensive lawyers to mount dumb arguments for you in large courts, I'd say. That's how that works. But yes, they've been making this claim. I think it's in relation to some of the ongoing litigation around Cambridge Analytica. They're saying, oh, we can't be held responsible in Australia for any data that was taken because we don't do business in Australia. And they're saying this at the same time that they're saying, oh, we won't be able to do all this stuff in Australia, which is really important to us and we love you, but don't do this to us. Like, it's just... yeah, left-hand, right-hand coordination, not the best there, I would have to say.
It's not a great look. And look, I'm as much of a lawyer as Lionel Hutz is, but my head wants to say that there was a defamation case, and we're going back a good number of years. A prominent Melbourne businessman,
Yes,
who sued, was it Dow, I think?
Yeah.
For defamation because because an article was readable in Australia, therefore was published in Australia.
And that stuck, yes.
Yeah. And I would have thought, well, once you've got that little plank in there, Facebook's argument, again, not a lawyer, but Facebook argument just doesn't feel that solid.
Yeah, it's very hard. I think that, I think that particular one, which is around that, I can't imagine that particular line is going to succeed. I think it's, we've clearly got a bit further to go with the whole what's going to happen with this. Because the thing is, if this legislation comes in, there's supposed to be this negotiating period. It's not like they're immediately, getting forced to do these things. There's supposed to be an attempt at negotiating. If it doesn't work, then you go to the arbiter. So even when this stuff becomes law, it doesn't immediately kick in. What we can expect is that the volume of commentary from Facebook, famous for never saying anything about anything and responding to nothing unless forced to, they'll be ramping it up, so we maybe get like a blog post a month from them. That means Google will be like running advertising all over its site, 500 reports, 600 blog posts, because they are really going hard on this. And they've continued going hard on this week as well, haven't they, Adam?
Yes, they did an experiment which only affected supposedly about 1% of users, but the experiment was that news searches and news sites were not turning up in their Google searches. And Google says, we were just trying things as an experimental thing, but it really felt like a pretty big, now I'm not cool enough to use this phrase, but is flex the word I'm looking for?
It's a flex. I mean, it is genuinely true.
I believe it's both a flex and a mood, in fact.
Yes.
It's a flex, it's a mood, it's a vibe. But to use our favourite legal term.
Sure.
But look, it is genuinely true. And I will say, when I saw some of the reporting around this as if, this never happens, Google really does run experiments all the time.
This always happens.
That affect like 1% of their results. I can remember in the past 2 years seeing experiments that went to both extremes. I can remember seeing Google News results with no Australian stuff in it. It's like, this isn't new. I can remember that 18 months ago. I can also remember experiments where the only local news that was showing up in Google News was the absolute top shelf, like the 5 biggest companies you can think of. It was literally the ABC, Nine, News Limited, SBS were looking, nothing else was showing. So they really do run a lot of tests like this. So I think that part's genuine. At the same time, it's a way of demonstrating, hey, we can do this. And this comes back to Facebook again. Businesses should have learned, media businesses should have learned that it was very silly to assume that the Facebook algorithm was your basis. This is how BuzzFeed got to be big, and this is how BuzzFeed got to be small. Because when the algorithm was adjusted and BuzzFeed stopped showing up so much, that ended up with them effectively shuttering their Australian operations. So a business that assumes that that's the only way it's going to get an audience is in trouble. At the same time, if you know it is a source of your traffic, you're going to have to play around with it. So this is just me just kind of circling around the point. There is no good, easy solve for this. The legislation isn't good enough, but the argument is going to go on and on because there's not. If there was a good, clean, obvious solve, everyone would be doing it.
Yeah. So when they come up with the negotiating the price here for this, are they compensating the news outlets for the use of the material, or are they giving the news outlets a slice of the profits that they're making from using the news material? Because it's a different way of looking at things, and that's kind of the argument that people have is, well, Facebook sharing things means people click on it and read it, and doesn't that put money in the newspaper's pocket? Like how will the economics around this work, do you think?
Well, it's not clear. I mean, the objection from the platforms has been that they think the default tips too far and puts more value on it than they could possibly attract. They probably can assign, they would have a very accurate value to assign of how much advertising to a person is worth. And you can approximate that by looking up an audience and seeing how much it costs you to get them on Facebook. I think what's tricky is the extent to which, Facebook benefits from the stories there and people see the headline. But how often do people don't click on the link half as often as they go past and respond? And we've all had that experience of like someone saying, "Oh, this story is appalling." It's like, well, if you've read the story, you know that's not what it says. They haven't necessarily read it, and this is where part of the problem is that there is a value to those platforms in the stories being visible that doesn't necessarily translate to either a click going through or even to something fuzzier like brand recognition that like, oh, I think, that makes me think, the ABC is a better place to get news, to pick a really stupid and trivial example. So I don't think we'll get that level of detail until there start being a few failed negotiations. And that stuff's probably not going to be hugely confidential or it's going to get leaked massively. Yeah. So we'll be able to see what values are attached. But nothing that I'm aware of in the current plans tells us what that is right now. We're in a real suck it and see phase of a potentially sucky policy.
Well, that static sound can only mean that, sadly, it's time to wrap up another episode of Vertical Hold. Thanks to Gus for making time for the show.
It's a pleasure. I look forward to sharing it on Facebook.
And hopefully they'll surface it for us. Now, Gus,
I want to be paid. How much do we get paid for that?
Start the negotiation.
Exactly. I'm a terribly hard negotiator. So, Gus, 3 quick questions to throw your way. If people want to find your work online or yourself on social media, where can they do that? And also, critically, your vote for the best children's cartoon character.
All right, you can find my written work at finder.com.au. You can find me on Twitter at GusWorldAU. And obviously, the best children's cartoon character, unequivocally, is Danger Mouse.
He's amazing. He's fantastic.
Wherever there is danger, he'll be there.
And as always, you can catch up with us online at VerticalHoldAU on Twitter, on the web at verticalhold.com.au, or via the Vertical Hold Facebook page, if it's still there after this week's show.
As always, thanks everyone for listening. We really appreciate you dropping by. Don't forget, tell your friends about us. Leave us a review on your podcasting platform of choice. It really helps us spread the word and bring in new listeners so we can be bigger and better in 2021. Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Aussie Broadband, changing the game with their award-winning network and Australian-based support. Gus, are you ready to don the tights and hop back in the ring?
Yes, but only if I can wear my underpants on the outside.
Well, naturally.
It gets awkward when he wears them on the inside.
Look, it's a popular video on some specialist channels.
If you look around, for sure. There is actually photos and maybe even video somewhere of Gus and I battling gladiator style at a tech event one year in tights, holding those big like jousting things that you smash gladiator into each
style,
other.
Yeah.
Gladiator style.
I remember this. I can't remember who won.
Neither do I. But the tights were pretty scary. I'm going to take the wild,
crazy guess that Dignity did not win.
Yes, Dignity was certainly the big loser that day. So, speaking of a certain lack of dignity, this week Tech Titans, Telstra and Facebook have spat the dummy and they're ready for a